and Dark Phoenix is the next movie that we're going to talk about here. So there was about a 3-year gap, and unfortunately, a lot happened in that 3 years between this movie and the development of Dark Phoenix. After the timeline was retconned with Days of Future Past, it was basically noted that a new adaptation of the Dark Phoenix saga could be made that would ultimately ignore the events of The Last Stand. Here we go again. We're just ignoring shit just because we can at this point. Both Simon Kinberg and Bryan Singer expressed interest in the prospect, and they hinted that Apocalypse could set up some of those elements, and basically casting Sophie Turner as a young Jean Grey would start to set that up to showcase how powerful she is. And so in 2016, Simon Kinberg said that the next X-Men film after Apocalypse would be set in the 90s, once again, advancing a decade. And later that year, Fox said that they were going to press the reset button on the franchise due to the underperformance of Apocalypse. Basically, the franchise was going to be reconfigured because Bryan Singer was not going to return. Too much controversy, too much Me Too shit happened with him, so he got ousted. But they renegotiated contracts with all of the main stars, and Simon Kinberg and his producing partner, they began discussing the story for the film, and they wanted to do, quote, something bold and radical and expand the universe in the same way that Logan feels bold and radical, and certainly Deadpool does as well, end quote. And Simon Kinberg pitched the film to the studio. He used all sorts of different footage of disasters and lightning strikes to try to convey a feeling. And this is something he felt very strongly about. He felt that this was the obvious next step for them to go, even though they had teased something else entirely in Apocalypse. They wanted to do Dark Phoenix again. He specifically wanted to do the Dark Phoenix story again, and ultimately, made way for that. So knowing that Apocalypse wasn't the greatest, and they were going to try to take another swing at Dark Phoenix, before we know all about the Disney drama and the purchase and acquisition, when you first heard that Dark Phoenix was going to be next up, and they had introduced Sophie Turner, and they were starting to sow those seeds in Apocalypse, what were you thinking about that movie and the prospect of what that story could be at the time?
I rolled my eyes. I ain't gonna lie to you. This was a moment where, bro, you again, you had me in the first half. I was really happy with Days of Future Past. Was very happy with First Class. Apocalypse happens, and you expect me to trust you with all the same components. All the same components, like nothing's really different. But Simon Kinberg, I guess, I was definitely like checked out, especially given they were doing Dark Phoenix again, and it wasn't. The thing is about Dark Phoenix is it is still one of the best comic book stories we've ever gotten, for sure. It's so good. When it's done right, everyone's like, "Oh my god, we love the Dark Phoenix." Yes, because it's good. But in this capacity, y'all showed me y'all couldn't do Apocalypse. Y'all showed me y'all couldn't do Phoenix one time before. You expect me to think y'all gonna be able to do it again with both of those things combined, coming after Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix? There's just no way, bro. There's no way this thing was gonna work out. So yeah, I remember already kind of like expecting them to make their bed and lay in it. I was like, there's no way this movie is going to be that great. Of course, there's always like the sliver inside of you that's like, man, I hope y'all do something well. I hope y'all do something good here. And what's so interesting about this movie is it is a more accurate depiction of what Phoenix is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, do they still butcher the hell out of this thing. So it's I remember that's exactly how I felt, man. I already kind of knew that it wasn't gonna be that great.
I mean, yeah, this definitely was not something I was like happy about and super excited about, because I'm like, well, wait a second here. We just introduced Sophie Turner, and in X-Men Apocalypse, she's already dealing with hallucinations, not being able to control her powers. They're already hinting at Dark Phoenix elements, and it's like, whoa, y'all are moving quicker than even the original trilogy did at that point, because at least we saw Famke Jensen in the first movie just be normal. They didn't start playing with it until the second movie. So now we're moving quicker, and this is a story that has to take place over an elongated amount of time. Like if you're gonna do movies, you probably need like at least 2 movies, maybe even 3. But it's more appropriate, I think, for serialized television, like a season of TV, if we're gonna take it that route. Like this is not something you rush out. The idea of doing a Dark Phoenix story within the constraints of a 2-hour movie or a 100-minute movie, they just make no sense at all, especially considering we had not even developed a care and a relationship with Sophie Turner's Jean Grey. Like, who really cared about her? And so at the beginning of this movie, when they go to space and she's already imbued with the Phoenix Force, like, okay, that sequence is fine, actually. I think that the space sequence in the beginning of the movie what it does well is create this sense of dread. Like, something bad's gonna happen. And I like the fact that we see some of the X-Men work together to try to save that rescue team that's out in space. Like, all of that stuff is pretty cool. But then from then
Yeah, it
on,
is.
once we get the story really in motion and she's already dealing with the stuff, it's just like, all right, we're moving way too quick once again. And even though it is more faithful, there is still a lot of stuff that's just like super similar. I remember
Yep.
I remember the trailer coming out, and people saw the trailer and they were like, this feels like The Last Stand. Like, like her and Charles are just like going back and forth arguing, and he's trying to save her, and the parent
Yep.
shit, is all involved. Like, we just kind of did this. Like, it's not that old. And that was just like a weird thing. But again, Simon Kinberg, he felt that this was like the thing to do. He said, quote, he felt in his gut that this was the story he needed to tell once Bryan Singer left the franchise, because the vision for him was so clear in his head, emotionally and visually, that it would have killed him to have somebody else direct the movie. So he thought that this was his calling. And it's kind of interesting to know that. But the movie was made, it was shot, but there's a lot of drama in terms of its release, because Fox ultimately delayed the movie's release in March of 2018, pushing it back from November 2nd, 2018 to February 14th of 2019. And this was apparently because Fox and Kinberg wanted to schedule some routine reshoots for the film after receiving some feedback from test screenings. But it was not possible to get all of the necessary cast members together until about August or September of that year. I remember this all super vividly because it's like 5 years ago.
Yep.
But this also would not have left enough time to complete post-production work, which he wanted to allot a full year just because of the intricacy of the effects with Jean Grey and the Dark Phoenix. And so they decided to do the additional pickups and footage. And ultimately, Simon Kinberg in that time had to rework the third act of his movie, and he rewrote a part of the script before the reshoots because things were too similar to some other movies that were coming out. The film's climax originally was set in space, and they underwent lengthy reshoots to give the finale a more grounded approach. And they wanted to avoid parallels with the endings of Captain America Civil War and Captain Marvel, the latter of which was also in production at the same time as this movie. And according to Simon Kinberg, the original ending didn't have the entirety of the X-Men assembled together, and the movie's use of characters was similar to Civil War in the sense that it had a big action set piece where everyone involved occurred at the end of the second act, whereas the third act involved fewer characters and more intimate exploration of their emotions. And Kinberg also admitted that Jean Grey's sequences in space displaying her full power that was initially conceived for the third act were reminiscent of some of the visuals that we saw in Captain Marvel. So this caused all sorts of fucking shit. Like, they delayed the movie pretty significantly to rework this whole thing. And it's funny because the third act of this movie, with the action and the train, it's actually pretty good. It's
the best part of the
it's
movie.
really good stuff.
That train is it. Train is it.
It's pretty crazy to know that this was not the first idea, but it's executed so well, the action in and of itself. But yeah, what do you think about hearing that again, competing studios, competing franchises are adversely affecting everybody involved now, so much so that like the MCU is on such a run that they have to go back and completely redo the entire third of the act of this movie as to now resemble something that was coming out from an entirely different franchise.
Yeah, what's interesting is I kind of get it. I do kind of get it. There was a moment, I even feel like we might have talked about this on the podcast, but like there was a moment where everything started to feel galactic. You know what I'm saying? Like everything started to feel like we were in space constantly. It was Guardians' fault. It was Captain Marvel's fault. You know what I mean? It was just so much happening in space all the time. I mean, there was other movies even outside of superhero stuff that was like taking place in space. We were getting just a ton of space movies, and so part of me understands, I think, the ambition to pivot, I think, away from that. But what's so annoying is like that's what makes Dark Phoenix though too. Like what makes Dark Phoenix so good in the animated series is like all the like they do a Phoenix Saga before that. It's not Dark Phoenix yet.
That's
It's
true.
a whole
Yeah.
Phoenix Saga, and then the Mkron Crystal arc stuff that's happening, and then there's a couple of fillers in there, Proteus, that kind of build up to Dark Phoenix. And this is like that's what make Dark Phoenix works though, was like you are now bought into this galactic thing that happens. You were bought into Jean being part of this galactic thing that is happening. And here it's just like, oh yeah, we've been grounded. Space. What are you talking about? How do we get here? And so, yeah, man, it's so interesting that we end up in this moment where it's like now space, we kind of got to stay away from it because the MCU was doing it. And I'm very curious to see what it would have looked like if they just didn't care about Captain Marvel and go all in, because it's not like Captain Marvel is the best movie we've ever seen either. You know what I'm saying? So part of me wonders what that would have looked like. But even Captain Marvel, they're on the ground for some of the movie. You're in space for some of the movie. So yeah, I'm just really curious to see what happened if they would have ignored all that and kind of went with what they wanted to. But also, we would have never got the train scene, which is the best part of the movie. So like, I don't, you know what I'm saying? It's like, but yeah, it's such an interesting thing to talk about. But like you said, they were butting heads, and so I think I'm happy that eventually we come to a place where we don't have to butt heads anymore.
This is what they fucking get. They shouldn't have done this movie to begin with. And then you wouldn't even have
Absolutely
to
not.
wouldn't even have to deal with this. You wouldn't even have to contend with this idea of like, oh, we got to reshoot the whole third act because it looks too similar to our competition. Like, okay, maybe this shouldn't have been the movie to begin with. That's where I stand with it. But as you said, the train sequence at the end, I mean, chef's kiss. That some of the best like teamwork from the mutants that we see. I mean,
Yes.
they finally like. Not completely, but they try to unleash Storm even in that sequence. Magneto goes crazy.
Nightcrawler
fucking eats in that scene. I mean, they're just going like ridiculous. We saw this together in the movies. I think we should also point that out. Like, this is the one movie out of everything we've talked about that we actually went to see. We were both here at the time. It also had the unfortunate distinction of being the first superhero movie to release after Avengers Endgame. So to follow up, literally at the time, what was the biggest movie in cinematic history,
and one of the best.
With this, and one of the best.
Yeah.
I mean, what a fucking position to be in. Like that's
what
just
a position.
I mean, it could not have ended on a worse note, for this franchise. It was, but I remember us being in the movie theater, pretty dreadful experience for those 2 hours, pretty bad. But then by the end of it, I remember this, both of us kind of perked up at the train scene. It was like, hold on here. Wait, this is kind of good. Like,
yeah,
it was, it was interesting to recall that and remember that. But they also tried to introduce Genosha in this movie as well, which, it's not terrible, but it's cool. It's like a little camp. Yeah, it's like little Magneto's camp. He used like broken ship parts, to sort of create this society. I mean, Genosha has so much to it. They didn't really do any groundwork or legwork before this to make it believable that it could be this like advanced society. And Genosha goes through a lot of iterations and evolution. It gets reduced to rubble, at certain points in the comics. It's also like this actual utopia at many points in turns. There's also like, in the comics, like, at its height, there's millions of inhabitants, like, before it gets destroyed. Like, there's like millions and millions of mutants there. Here it's like 65. It's like 65 of them are like residing at this camp.
Yorktown. Hell yeah. There's nobody in there.
Not really. Pretty small community. But what did you think about at least, the mention of it? I mean, by the time we see the movie, we already kind of know this is the end of it. There's nothing coming out after this. But I guess we got Genosha for the first time, and we can sort of judge it that way.
Yeah, I actually didn't even like mind the scene it was kind of a part of, because I liked finally seeing, I think, Eric and Magneto just have his own group of people. I was like, oh shoot, he finally has his own group of people, because Michael Fassbender in general, we only kind of see him have the team like at the end of First Class. You know what I'm saying? We never really got him with the team like that. And this was like, oh shoot, he has actually some people and he had his telepath like tell everybody to be calm but stay ready. Like, I was like, oh, that's really cool that you have a telepath doing that. So I like the idea. Again, I don't know if the execution is fully there, because for me, part of Genosha that makes it so cool is seeing the utopia part, is seeing like that makes it what it is to me. So it was like, I guess this is cool, but at least they decided to put him somewhere, and I think at least it being at Genosha made sense. But I agree, they didn't do any of the legwork to get us there. But I think that small story beat of him being at Genosha made sense.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, because like now we're talking about these 4 movies literally taking place over the course of 30 years, but nobody is aged today, really. He's finally found this place, this safe haven for mutants, and then I think that made sense, like that. It took us, multiple films to get there. They could have, sort of alluded to it earlier. We should have had like more mentions of like what that could look like so that we can get here and it makes sense. But then on the flip side of things, Charles is like embracing the popularity of the X-Men. He's like fully engulfed in
Mm-hmm.
this idea of them being celebrities, and he's kind of, stroking his own ego. This is really the first time they started to, well, not the first time. Days of Future Past does it a lot, playing with his, his morality and his inner demons. But, we're starting to get to those questionable aspects of Charles in this movie as well. And so, there
Yeah.
were elements of just, or benefits, I think, to having like a relationship with these characters for multiple movies, those two in particular, where it's like, oh yeah, we can like start to pay off some of these things that might have been talked about early. Again, could have been more stuff, but Genosha is like a decent example of that, even though it's not the best version of what it could have been. And I think even what
Mm-hmm.
Charles goes through in the movie, and just like the conflicts that he deals with, and the fact that he's like always sacrificing the team while never putting himself in harm's way, which, Jean calls him out on, or not Jean, but Mystique, she calls him out on that. That's one of the things where it's like, okay, these are things that are shaping up to be somewhat of a good story. It makes sense. Like, the performances here are really good for the most
Yeah.
part, because it's like we have been with these
Mm-hmm.
people, but
Yeah.
at the same time, we've made a lot of mistakes along the way and we've stumbled. Last big thing we got to talk about here is the Disney acquisition of Fox, when this all went down in the middle of the production of this movie. While this is technically the last X-Men film made by 20th Century Fox, and also the final entry in the X-Men films, it's also technically the first X-Men film to be distributed by Disney, which is just like so weird to think about. But Disney acquired Fox in March of 2019, ultimately buying out the assets of 20th Century Fox. And Vanity Fair put out a report that the film faced promotional difficulties because long-term employees of Fox and the marketing team had been laid off after the merger with Disney. And they were, and a Fox marketing executive had said, quote, "We know when we are dropping a trailer, but we are nowhere near where we should be at this time. It's frightening. I would be mad if I were a filmmaker," end quote. Deadline also, sort of added a report basically saying that they had been hearing problems with the marketing. Again, I distinctly remember this. There were so many confusing aspects about the marketing, and of course Disney buying Fox didn't really help. And Disney tried to
Mm-hmm.
integrate, the film into their marketing campaign in their department, but they just didn't really have enough time to do so before it was ultimately released. This just created like the worst possible scenario, right? Like, the movie was already not great in and of itself. On top of that, it has a lot of drama behind it if you're following it. And then for maybe probably
Mm-hmm.
the majority of the audience, I would assume, they might not even know about it. They're not even aware, because you can't have a proper marketing campaign and rollout for this. And based off of what Apocalypse did, it wasn't the greatest film to begin with. And so there was just a lot working to get this against this movie. But what do you remember about that time? Just some of the confusing aspects, and just the fact that I think all of the anticipation that we may have had going into it was pretty much just taken away because there was just too much drama surrounding it to even make it a feasibly good movie.
Yeah, man. I mean, mess can get exhausting really fast, and I think that's what Dark Phoenix was, and especially again coming off of a movie that was already kind of a mess with Apocalypse, and then we get into, we know this movie's coming out, and like you said, with all the Disney stuff happening, you just kind of go, I guess I'll go see this movie. You know what I mean? Like, that's what it really comes down to. It's like, I guess we'll go see this movie, because it's also noisy. It all gets very loud and again very exhausting, and so it was weird seeing. I think I don't know if a fight is a good word, but all the ridiculousness and messiness happening. It was just weird seeing it, because it had been, I think, the loudest at this point. Like, this is one of the moments where, of course, we have been following this stuff for a long time, right? Like, as people who ingest this information and stuff, but it was people like not like us knowing about all of this stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, up, Disney and Fox are going through this thing, or like this trailer is weird and all of this stuff is weird. So yeah, it had been like so much more, I think, prominent and in cultural. Like, a lot of people were seeing this stuff go down in real time who didn't really pay attention to this stuff before. So yeah, it was really crazy.
This was a huge casualty of all of this, maybe the biggest one, because this movie was super expensive and they lost a lot of money on it. But yeah, man, when you see this all go down, it completely saps any excitement you might have for it when you hear about all this drama. It just reiterates to me, like, damn, is there really any possible way that this movie can be good, knowing that they went through extensive reshoots? They're trying to avoid looking like the competition. They're getting bought out by another company. Ultimately, this isn't going to mean anything because the franchise is going to end. It's just all that stuff, all the narrative that just creates this perfect storm for this to just not be a successful movie. And then, the script isn't
Mm-hmm.
great, and the story isn't great on top of all of that. It was just a bad recipe for what they ultimately delivered. As I said, the production budget for the movie was $200 million, and it ultimately ended up making $252.4 million at the global box office. And Deadline calculated that the net loss of the film would be $133 million when factoring together all the expenses and revenues. making it one of the biggest box office bombs in history. And it did not do better critically. 22% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, average score of
Mm,
43 out of 100 on Metacritic, B minus cinema
that's good actually.
score. Uh,
Why is that good?
it's not it. It truly ends
Hmm.
this franchise on possibly the worst note that you could end a series of movies on.
Yep.
So I guess just in closing, what do you want to say about that? Just the fact that after all these years, we did all these movies. We had some really high highs with those first two. The third one, stumbles, and really the X-Men legacy. How it kind of concluded here, which is just kind of crazy to
Yeah.
think about because New Mutants did come out, but COVID was a whole thing, and pretty much nobody saw it.
Hmm.
I think that this is a lot of people's lasting impression of this era of Fox X-Men movies, and so how do you sort of recontextualize that, knowing now that they will get rebooted in the MCU in the future, but also the fact that things just did not end on a high note here?
Yeah, man. I think at the time, like you said, it leaves such a sour taste in your mouth that this era of X-Men would be left with this movie. Like this movie is really bad to me. But then on the flip side, there was like at least Marvel has acquired the rights. You know what I'm saying? There was still like a little bit of, well, I guess this is our last bad hoorah. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of was a little bit of the feeling at the time. And of course, moving into the future, I can't wait to see what possibly Deadpool Wolverine might do. There's so many questions in that film, man. And part of me feels like there's no way, if we're talking about Elektra and Daredevil, that we're not going to talk about Dark Phoenix and Apocalypse. You know what I'm saying? Like, part of me is like, they going to say something.
Mm.
Either Deadpool, Ryan Reynolds, he going to say something about Oscar Isaac, or, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's going to be something in that movie to refer to this, because it's too in your face. It literally is the cross line of what Fox and Disney is. You know what I'm saying? So part of me feels like they're going to talk about this movie. So yeah, it leaves a sour taste, but again, I'm still hoping there's some things in the works and being done to kind of fix all of this. But again, it only kind of adds, I think, a little bit more excitement knowing that potentially the MCU and what Marvel might do is just simply not going any of these directions. You know what I'm saying? It is simply be like, all right, we're not doing that ever again. We're not doing any of this. Let's stay away from this. Let's stay away from that. Like I like that idea. So yeah, again, sour taste in our mouth to leave this. But I think there's still a little bit of hope, knowing that the MCU and potentially the mutant saga, hopefully, that we get eventually, is still on the horizon.
A lot of lessons can be learned from everything here. I mean, as the reason behind this podcast series is to really sort of examine and break these movies down in the context of how they were made. These are pretty significant Hollywood stories, business stories on how these
Mm-hmm.
things all shake out. They shape the trajectory of an entire franchise, and to a large degree an entire studio. And this last film, Dark Phoenix, was truly sort of the last signal, the last beacon of what 20th Century Fox represented before they were acquired. And it's again, it's not a great note to go out on by any stretch of the
Mm-hmm.
imagination. Sometimes you just wonder, like, maybe they should have got out ahead and ended it before things ended up this bad. You want to try to go out on top as best as you can, but it doesn't always shake out that way. And especially in the superhero genre, as we continue to reiterate and mention, conclusions are extremely rare. Ending things and bringing things to a close almost never happens with these stories, for multiple reasons. One, it's hard to do, and secondly, these studios won't let them in because there's just more money to make. There's more stories to tell. But this one is particularly sad to see, just because like they had really a great out to kind of just like wrap things up, whether it be with Days of Future Past or Logan. Like they had moments to really
Mm-hmm.
just like say, like, this is the final stamp that we're going to put on this franchise. But they just couldn't. They just couldn't allow themselves. They wanted to tell more stories, and
Agreed, man.
we ended up with some pretty bad stuff at the end of the day. But as you said, it does create an opportunity for better things to come, and I do think that better things are ahead. And last thing I'll just mention is that Kevin Feige, who runs Marvel Studios, I think he has a very personal relationship with all of this stuff. He started his
He was
career
there.
on X-Men in 2000. He was working underneath Lauren Schuler Donner, and this is where he got to start. And he's never left Marvel ever since then. And now he finally has X-Men back in his possession. and eventually they're going to roll that movie out and kick off what this new phase, this new saga of films are going to be. So you just have to imagine that this is going to be pretty special and pretty important to him. Maybe the most important thing that he puts his hands on whenever it does come out. But we will certainly have to wait and see, and hopefully Deadpool and Wolverine in a couple of weeks gives us a sign of the future. But folks, with all of that said, that's all we have for this episode of Two Black Nerds. Thank you as always for tuning in to another podcast.